Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Francesca Royster about her book, Choosing Family, a Memoir of Queer Motherhood and Black Resistance. Welcome, Franny.
Thank you, Dan. How are you?
I am wonderful. How are you?
Very well. Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to talk to you today.
I'm so happy. I came to this book knowing that it would be good because I know you're a publicist, so which is always a good thing. But I came to this book looking to learn something, and boy, did I. You share such a love story that just was so profound. Congratulations on a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dan.
My pleasure. One of the things that I was so impressed about was you talk about your mother and your grandmothers and how they took in people who needed taking in at the moment. Some stayed for a little while, some stayed for a longer while. Mm-hmm. What was that like for you?
Well, it's funny because the history of my great-grandmother, by the time I came around, she had kind of shifted to folks in the family who needed home and who are kind of in between their households. And so I really admired it. And I was also just very curious about the lives of, my uncle. And then my mom had these great stories of folks who were like distant relatives or strangers who were there. And she was actually a writer herself and would write about like being allowed to wander into the rooms and kind of look at all the different like jewelry or bottles of perfume of the people who lived in the other parts of the house. And to her, it was like this amazing place of like just seeing how other people live and connecting and bringing them in. And then I think at Seeley's, at my great grandmother's house, the kitchen was a common space. So that was where, she didn't have to prowl around. You could actually like hang out with people and talk to them. So when my mom, would bring in friends or relatives and they would stay, or now when Annie and I have friends over, our kitchen table is kind of that place of connection and commonality. And I mean, if we were more wealthy, we would have more spaces, but the table is it. So, but that's a really great place. And, food is such a common connector, cooking together when you can. And that's really a place where I heard a lot of stories and really kind of grew to understand how important it is to connect to people who might not be totally from the same experiences that you have, to find common ground.
I found that growing up, a little phrase that I heard from relatives were if they allowed you to put your feet under their table. And while because that is a shared experience. I think the kitchen more than anywhere else. In the living room, you can have a conversation, but when you're in the kitchen, you become intimate.
Yeah.
You get to share that. That's something that I noticed with you and your wife, Annie, in the book, a lot of discussions about adopting. When you got Cece, a lot of the discussions take place in the kitchen.
Yeah. It is this commonplace. And even now, we wake up really early to get everybody, get the lunches ready. And I know it sounds very conventional, but, just those things, getting the coffee. And it is a place where we figure out, sometimes problem solve on the spot. We connect, we kind of, get our little hugs in for the day or the morning. So it's a really important place. It's also, being in Chicago, it's physically warm. It's like a warm
Yes.
Yeah, there's always something about food that just helps sustain you. And even when we're giving a party, we give a lot of parties, like dinner parties. Well, before the pandemic, we gave more, but people would come in and they would start like chopping up things. And it was an important place to also kind of give up a little power because when someone else, when a friend or even a relative goes into your kitchen and starts messing with your food, you've got to trust them a little bit. So,
A whole lot often.
yeah, yeah.
So this book is about partially about adopting your daughter,
Mhm.
and you talk about in the book there are three ways that people get children.
Yes.
Can you describe those three ways and your experience with them?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So there is, maybe there are even more than three ways, but one way that is kind of historically has been historically true of African American families has been kind of informal adoption, like absorbing members of the family. And that's kind of, sort of what my great grandmother did and what other folks who I know and who are related to, that if there was, a family crisis, then you stepped in and you took care of the child and raised them hopefully as your own for however long they needed you. Then there is adoption that is through the foster care system. And that's also, a lot of people work that way. It's a way also of sort of stepping in terms of crisis too.
Mhm.
But there's also that intermediary of, the state and government. So there's some ways that we wrestled with that form of adoption because sometimes it felt like it was being used as a punishment, for men and women, but especially women. And so we just paused about that. And then there's formal adoption, like private adoption, um, which was the route that we took. And this particular agency that we went with, the Cradle in Evanston, Illinois, really has an approach that emphasizes open adoption. And what that open adoption can look like is really dependent on an agreement between the birth family and you, the adopted family. So, really, with this agency, the birth family kind of has the reins, and so they really decide the limits and how much information there is. So, for some folks, like some of the parents that we grew up with or like we were trained with, they actually like met the birth families. They visited with them. They were kind of integrated into part of their lives. In our case, we have occasional emails, and but we also know some of the daughters who are also of the birth moms. So who are also adopted. So, but the cradle also holds information. So if a birth family and decides they don't want to have any communication, you can still, as a parent or even as a child, write letters, and they will keep an archive, so that at some point, if a parent is ready, birth parent is ready, they can have communication or at least have a history of connection. So they're really like, I think, recognizing the ways that the older approach to adoption as something that you didn't talk about socially, and that kids weren't supposed to know about, especially that wasn't a healthy, or it could be an unhealthy approach. Sometimes it worked, but that it's important to give agency on both sides, and that at the heart of that, I think, is recognizing really that it's a very to choose an adoption plan is a very, I think, ultimately a heroic thing if you've scrutinized your life and realized that for whatever reason you're psychologically, economically unable to give the best life to a child, to really be able to find the folks that you really want your child to the family that you want your child to be part of, is really deliberate and kind of sacrificial thing, because I'm sure it's not having been in that position. I'm still sure that it's a really difficult decision, and it continues, like even after adoption, the difficulty of it, continues. So
It is a birth mother carries a child to term, and there are all kinds of emotions that go along during that term.
yeah,
I will never be in that position to have to give up a child, but I can only imagine that a lot of birth mothers realize that the child would be better off somewhere else. The
Yeah.
sad thing is, I think for so many years we've looked, well, not we, some people have said that, oh, that mother is XYZ, and those
Yeah.
things simply may not be. The ultimate outcome is what happens with the child. It's
Right.
so much less what society thinks and so much
Hmm.
about what the child needs in that moment. I
Yeah.
noticed in the book, one of the things that you talk about so openly is the fear of, if you went with foster care,
Yeah.
that route, that if the child was only temporary, because we do get attached to other humans. And I tell you, I felt that through my whole soul, that I was
Mm.
like, because I think that would have been the same reaction I would have had. It's
Yeah.
a it's a very it's a very moving and very tender thing, because I think to adopt, it comes with a lot of things. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is you and Annie having to set up a profile. And that hit me straight out of left field. And I'm like, a profile? Because you think of dating sites and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I understand. Tell me about the profile and how that played with your mind.
Oh, it really did play with my mind. Yeah, it's true. Well, when we started the training, we were with kind of a cohort, like you were going through graduation, of other people. We also looked at the profiles of other people who came before us, and we also had workshops with parents who had adopted, and they talked about their experiences. But the profile was a really funny thing. There's like the online profile, which is more schematic, and then you make a physical book, like a photo book, representing yourself. And like it was, in some ways, maybe it got my mind ready to write a memoir, because it was about like thinking about who's the public facing self, but also like you don't want to be completely public because you want people to know who you really are. So how do you convey that in visuals? You usually have photographs, or you might have some script, and it's also something that you have to create that's accessible to different kinds of folks, different levels of education. There's so much that you want to signal. But Annie and I really also just wrestled with the fact that because we're unconventional in that we are in our 40s and 50s, that we were two lesbians, that we were a mixed race couple. Like there were ways that we did and didn't want to follow the examples that we saw in the photo books, which are usually, like in general, they were very sparkling clean and very, pretty and very neat and controlled. And like we are many things, but like we're kind of alive. We have a lot of stuff around. We are connected to a lot of people. Um, so we included in our photo book like a lot of photos of ourselves with our chosen family, the people who are the friends that are especially close to us, with our blood family, lots of eating scenes. We put in a few scenes of us like doing hiking and things like that, because we do actually do hike, but not quite as much as the scene from the photo
What
book, because we wanted to look, pretty strong.
active? That's right.
And our
Yes,
daughter, as it turns out, is incredibly active. So
nice.
even if we weren't active before, we definitely are now. Like she climbs trees, she does gymnastics in the house. Like she's very, very energetic person. So
I love that. I do know that one thing that you mentioned, and it is something that as we age, which is a process we all go through,
yeah,
you start looking at, will I be old enough to pick up a newborn or one that's crawling around or run behind one? And I do think that that's always something that's on everyone's mind. But I also like the fact that you and Annie decided to do it a little later. Uh,
yeah,
the love story, which really came through between the two of you, is how really you worked well together, that
yeah,
you are very clear about a couple of what I might call rough patches, or patches where you needed a little space. But I really felt, I mean, you guys came back as such stronger adults. Cheers to that. I, and you give a child something different in the fact, if you were both 18 or 20, you give that child that. but you're both academics and you've had a career and you have a career and you give Cece something very different. So I think that's a great thing.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I hope that's like we never knew what exactly was the combination of things that brought us together with Cece's birth mom, but she did have this photo book. But we think that it is some of the things that are, our assets as folks who have built careers and are passionate about them, and then we've traveled and we've just lived, and also taking care of people and nurturing
Yes.
people before we became mothers. So we hope that that came through. But I think that our love story part was really important because even more than we thought, like being a parent is really challenging, and you have to kind of
Mm.
know, even if we're not always on the same page, and we're not always on the same page because we're totally different people, but like we understand each other and we have like a basic faith in the goodness of one another. So that gets us through a lot. And, yeah, so
I
it
love
really
that, and it comes through.
oh,
Now it really does. Now I have to mention one person in the book that I am willing to run over with anybody's baby stroller, and that's a character named Lynn. I was blown away by some of the things she said, and what
yeah,
I realized is, unfortunately, there are a lot of people like Lynn in this world.
yeah,
Um, at least what I read, and I'll ask you to speak about it, I felt that she was so judgmental that you adopted
mhm,
and that someone would give a child up. And there again, that sort of shook me to my core because I was like, wow, no filter whatsoever. Was that how you took it?
yeah, it was. Sometimes I have found that, as an adoptive parent, we find ourselves just in these conversations that are very personal and very frank. And yeah, like lots of times people don't realize that what they're saying is very judgmental and really, like a private, somewhat private thing. So yeah, and that person is someone who I think that she was well-meaning, and I think that she was bringing with her a very, okay, I'll just say heteronormative kind of framework for the world, in that, like, for her as a pregnant person, married person, that, like, she's, like, the ideal, and everybody else is kind of like the
Mm.
sort of someone who is asking permission for, for our existence. But I really, in including that scene, like that, all my writing teachers always say, yeah, don't write for revenge. And so I really wasn't writing for revenge, but I did want to just kind of articulate things that we've heard different versions of, which are, like that we've saved Cece, or that she, as adoptive parents are, yeah, kind of there to save someone who's been thrown away, which, that's a terrible feeling and a terrible idea, but it is one in our culture. So, I just wanted to kind of give voice to that, and also to think about those spaces. Sometimes those family spaces or kid spaces can be just a place of, yeah, just like searing judgment and gossip and all that stuff. And so part of like one of our strategies, which is not at all isn't very feminist, when we have to go to a birthday party, is to hang out with the dads, because the dads don't talk. They just stand around on their phone.
They're a lot less willing to run down everybody. They're happy they have hopefully someone that's watching the child.
Exactly, exactly. But that's not true of all
No, no, I know
dads
it's
and all
not.
mothers, but because we've made some really nice friends
I
in
bet
connection with
so.
CC. But sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes, so a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine is adopted, and he has siblings that are not adopted. And he was talking with his mom about his adoption one time, and she knew his frame of mind at that moment. And she said to him very directly, I chose you.
Mm,
I had three children and I loved them, but I simply chose you. And I think to be an adoptive parent, that is what you do. You choose to open your heart and your soul and your home to
mhm.
someone. And
Yeah.
then, of course, what I did learn in this book is it's not an easy process. I mean, you talk about the classes and things that you had to take
Yeah.
that the average person who simply gets pregnant doesn't have to do. But I
Yeah.
thought, oh my, that's a lot of hoops to jump through. And some of them are understandable. You know, of course, agencies want to know that the prospective parents are okay. But you took a year or more of classes, is that
Mhm.
right?
Yep, that's right. It was 9 months, so it was almost exactly
Wow.
completion time. But yeah, it was a pretty profound process because it gave us a chance to talk to people who have experienced different levels or different stages of adoption too, to hear from birth parents also and from their perspective what it's been like, to talk to, like, doctors, to talk to, psychologists who are doctors too, prospective parents, to learn CPR, all those things that I hope I still remember if it
Well,
ever.
I didn't even know that surprised me. It was something small, but I was like, "Oh, okay, that's
Yeah,
good to know." But regular, what? Sorry, pardon me. I was about to say regular parents. That's not a nice way to put it. So, birth parents aren't required to take CPR classes,
right.
and I was like, "Oh my goodness."
Yeah, yeah, it's really good. I do think that those are things that everyone should have access to. I don't know
Yes.
if everyone should be required to do them, but I do think that having that information available, and because our agency also focuses on African American, or this part of it focused on African American kids, and some of the adoptions are transracial, there was a lot of information about African American culture, raising African American children, what it's like to be a family that is multiracial, how to do hair and skin,
Mhm.
skincare, like, some of the things that, if you are non-African American, you might not know, but are really, really important for helping support, a kid's self-esteem and sense of themselves. So, um, yeah, I think that there's a lot of information, and I think it's a good thing. Maybe, yeah.
I think it's a great thing. So, as you're an English teacher or
Uh-huh.
professor, is that right?
Yep.
So,
Totally
I'm
was.
I'm curious about the title of your book. I intrigues me because I see that you use the word choosing and
Mhm.
not chosen. Was
Mhm.
that on purpose?
Well, we played with so many titles, and I think originally I had suggested Chosen Family, and I think it was the editor who I was talking to was saying, "Well, this is like an more active word, and so it's really about." It kind of summons both the concept of kind of chosen family as kind of a queer family
Mhm,
concept, or
mhm,
LGBTQ concept that's very important to us as a culture, but also like the process of deciding to have a family that was part of our story, and that how those things kind of work together. So in the end, I was sold, but I had another title completely that I really liked, and it turned out that someone else published a book with that title, just a few months before I was ready to let go of my manuscript. And it's a very different book. I think it was a book about theology.
okay.
So I didn't feel like it was competing, but I couldn't really use the title that I wanted. So,
I like choosing because I also feel that it's still active.
mhm,
I feel like your book certainly points out the fact that you and your partner and your daughter are still choosing family, and that was a very nice thing.
thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a website or social media that you'd like to share?
Okay, I am on Instagram, at Royster Francesca, I think is what it is. I am working on my website, but for now, you can find me at, DePaul English, DePaul, I think it's DePaul.edu, DePaul's English department website, and
Okay,
that will get you to my writings, so for sure. I'm
perfect.
on Facebook too.
Oh, lovely.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Fanny, for coming on and talking about your memoir, Choosing Family. It is so delicious, and I cannot recommend it enough.
Thank you so much, Dan. I appreciate you, and thank you for reading.
Thank you. Hang on for me just a minute.
Okay.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com.
on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out With Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.